Welcome. This panel discussion is a recreation of one hosted by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 2008. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor is grateful to the Heritage Foundation and to the Business Growth Initiative for creating the event at which these four indexes were originally brought together. These indexes are used by the GEM teams in their research, and together they provide a multidimensional understanding about the various aspects of business and the economic environment for entrepreneurship. I'll next introduce Patricia Costello, who will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion. Trish is the director of the Arthur M. Blank Center for Entrepreneurship here at Babson College. Among her many accomplishments, she's recognized internationally for her pioneering work as founding CEO and now CEO Emeritus of the Kauffman Fellows, the premier education program for venture capitalists globally. She's president of the holding company for the $310 million fund, which endows the Center for Venture Education. She was also on the startup team of the Kauffman Foundation, the $2 billion foundation for entrepreneurship. She's played a leading role nationally in obtaining larger equity investments for women's businesses and in funding initiatives supporting high-growth women entrepreneurs. Trish?
All right. Thank you. Well, I am new to Babson College, having just moved here 6 months ago, and I'm going through my first New England winter. So days like this are a challenge for me, and I bet for a number of you that are coming from places that are perhaps a little warmer than what we have here. But welcome here. We are thrilled to have you on behalf of the Arthur M. Blank Center for Entrepreneurship. Let me welcome you as well to the Babson campus. As a part of the Kauffman Foundation in 1993 on their startup team, was able to experience the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor from the seed funder side, because we were kind of the financier originally of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. So I had the opportunity for about 5 years to be one of the mouthpieces, the non-researcher speaker on the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor across the world. And so I'm so pleased to be able to reconnect with this. And I would just say that from the Kauffman Foundation's standpoint, GEM was one of the greatest successes of all time. And Kauffman has put in hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, and this was one of those that always rates in the top 3. So in that way that there are many fathers to successes, there are so many of us that continue to see this as one of the bright spots in the last decade. The work that you've done has been amazing, and we really should give ourselves a round of applause for our 10th anniversary here at the Global Entrepreneurship. Well, as the other speaker said, now more than ever is it important for us to step up and to lead. We're being called to advise and to provide help and assistance and information and direction to public policymakers and government leaders around the world. So if there was ever an organization designed and created for the times we live in today, it's the people in this room with the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. We are so pleased as we look forward with this that we have partners and collaborators and colleagues that are working in the same space. Now, in spring of this past year, before we really, I think many of us knew what was up, before us with the economy, the Heritage Foundation asked our head of our U.S. team at the time, Elaine Allen, who I believe is with us. Where are you, Elaine? You here? Is she getting coffee? She may be out there with coffee. But the Heritage Foundation asked us to join them, Elaine, as the head of the U.S. GEM team, to join a panel discussing business enabling environment ranking systems and enterprise development. The other panelists were the World Bank's Doing Business Index, the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, and the panel was such a success for that group that we thought that we should really bring this topic up again today for the benefit of our global partners for GEM, and also to get an update on what we're seeing and what these experts with our GEM people are seeing with today's economic situation. So we have asked our 4 panelists to each spend 15 minutes giving us kind of an overview A summary of their methodology, the particulars of their ranking systems, 15 minutes each, and then we'll have at least 30 minutes for question and answers from this group. So let me introduce to you our 4 panelists, because each of them will be giving a PowerPoint. They'll stay in the audience until the end, and then we'll come up here for our questions. Our first panelist is Ambassador Terry Miller. Ambassador Miller here. Ambassador Miller is Director of the Center for International Trade and Economics at the Heritage Foundation. The Center's signature publication is the Economic Freedom Index, and as his title indicates, he has served as Ambassador to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. Now, each of these people, as you can imagine, have about a 20-page CV, so we're doing a very short intro, but they'll also talk with you as well about their specialty areas. Dr. Alan Dennis. Alan, right here in the front. Alan is here with us. He's from the World Bank. He's on the Doing Business team, and he also leads the Trading Across Borders indicator. And he has also worked in trade and investment climate issues at his time at the World Bank. Irene Mia. Am I seeing her? Irene, right here. Irene is the director of the Global Competitiveness Index and a senior economist with the Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. Her responsibilities include researching competitiveness issues and developing the economic content for the World Economic Forum activities. She's the editor of the Global Information Technology Report. And then our own Neil Ozma. And Neil, we already know, we've heard more detail about him. So good to have you, Neil. He's the cleanup hitter of the 4, and then we will go to questions after that. So without any further introduction, to jump right into the meat of our topic, I'm going to ask Ambassador Miller to start us off.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I think that there's a lot of synergy between the activities that we all undertake. I know that the Index of Economic Freedom and the GEM report are highly complementary, both in their results and in their methodology. We actually do things quite differently, but when you put the results together, I think you will see that they reinforce each other. At the Index, at the Heritage Foundation, we and the Wall Street Journal, who co-published the Index of Economic Freedom with us, have been doing this now for 15 years. This is our 15th anniversary edition. That's what it looks like. I hope you all had an opportunity to pick up a copy of it on CD. They are outside on the table, and please take one. We also have the complete index and all of the database, the entire 15-year database that we've been working off of to produce these reports. It's available online at heritage.org. So I would invite you to go there, duplicate our results, point us in a direction for new ways in which we might manipulate that data in order to gain more insight into what's going on around the world. When we measure economic freedom, for the Index of Economic Freedom, we look at 10 separate areas. Now, it's important to notice that in none of these are we, in almost none of these, are we looking at survey data. The most significant exception is the corruption indicator, number 9, but there's also some survey data which we'll hear about from the World Bank in their process, and we use a lot of their data in both business freedom and labor freedom. What are we looking at? Business freedom, how easy is it to start a business, to operate a business, and also how easy is it to stop a business, which is equally important for entrepreneurs. Trade freedom is an indicator of how open an economy is to the world. Fiscal freedom looks primarily at tax rates. Government size looks at the expenditure side of government. How much is government spending as a portion of gross domestic product? Monetary freedom looks at monetary stability and primarily through examination of the inflation rates. Investment freedom is similar to trade freedom. How easy is it to invest, particularly for foreigners, but Also, what are domestic investment regulations like? Financial freedom looks at the banking system. Is it competitive? Is it open? How much government interference or control is there? Property rights, a fundamental measure, particularly in developing countries. We look at the rule of law overall and also at the protection of private property. Freedom from corruption, I indicated that was survey data. We rely on Transparency International and their Corruption Perceptions Index. So it's a measure of how corrupt a government or a society is perceived to be by its citizens and those who operate within it. And finally, labor freedom, how easy is it to hire new employees, and also how easy is it to fire existing employees. We put those together. We don't give any particular weight to one or another. Each factor, each component there is scored on a 0 to 100 basis. It's about half and half in terms of half of the indicators are straightforward mathematical formulas where we're plugging in things like tariff rates or indicators of non-tariff barriers. Some of the others, particularly investment freedom and financial freedom, we rely more on, we rely in some cases on interviews, we rely on published data from sources like the Economist Intelligence Unit, or any indicators we can get of the levels of activity and the regulatory environment that business people face in those countries. So those are a bit more subjective. After we score each individual factor, we run a simple average of the scores, and that is the overall economic freedom score for a country. I think this pretty well just repeats what I just said. I've just at random picked a sample country page. Well, maybe it's not at random. To show you what our data looks like. I know it's almost impossible to read there on the screen, but you can see that there's an overall summary on the left-hand side there of the situation in a country, whether economic freedom is increasing or decreasing. We give a little political background at the bottom. It's surprising and depressing in how many countries of the world the lack of political stability is such a fundamental factor impacting on economic development and certainly economic freedom and economic growth. Particularly in the African countries, it's very depressing to see the reports in that background section of coup after coup, or on the other hand, leaders who have been in place for 30 years or more in countries where there's simply no accountability to the people. On the right-hand side, we give a little description of what's happening on each of the 10 components. And I've made some of these a little bit bigger so you can see. We report each of the factor scores. We relate them to the world average scores. The vertical bars here indicate the world average scores. You can see that the United States is higher levels of economic freedom in every case except for fiscal freedom and government size, where we lag behind world averages. The little indicators there in the middle, the diamond shapes, show whether a score has gone up or down in a given factor over the course of the year. This shows the evolution of scores over time, again measured against the world average. The U.S. significantly above the world average, ranking 6th this year, always ranking in the top 10 from the inauguration of our index in 1995. Which countries did the best? Which did the worst? Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, Ireland, New Zealand. You can see the list there. Asia does quite well. 4 of the top 10 are countries in the Asia-Pacific region. 10 of the top 20 countries are in Europe. I think in many respects the bottom 10 is more interesting. When you look at the countries there that are really very repressed in terms of economic freedom and openness to entrepreneurship. And indeed, there are no countries on that list that are performing well economically. This year, Zimbabwe's economic freedom score dropped more than any other country. Venezuela had the next largest drop in economic freedom. And we're seeing, of course, economic tragedies, certainly in Zimbabwe and surprisingly also now in Venezuela. We also include in the Index of Economic Freedom 2 to 3 analytical essays each year. We include regional summaries that try to analyze the data on a regional basis. And we run correlations with other indicators from other organizations. Our analytical essays this year, there's one that looks at the 15-year database and looks at long-term trends. The most interesting results of that analysis were the levels of extraordinary progress by the countries of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, which have gained significantly in economic freedom, in some cases leapfrogging over 30 or 40% of the countries in the world in levels of economic freedom. They've enjoyed sustained growth at the same time, averaging over 7% growth in per capita GDP over the life of the index. We also have a look back this year because it's our 15th anniversary, extracting articles from all of our previous editions of the Index of Economic Freedom and trying to pull out what we call the first principles of economic freedom. And finally, we have an article this year, an essay by Stephen Moore of the Wall Street Journal, looking at tax rates around the world. We call the essay, "The World Discovers the Laffer Curve," and indeed what we find is an extraordinarily strong tendency towards tax cutting worldwide. It's particularly marked in Europe, and particularly so in Eastern Europe, and we find that corporate tax rates have been cut in many countries, at least in half. Interestingly enough, the United States now has the second highest corporate income tax rates of any country in the world. So that may be something that we want to look at in this country. In terms of regional analysis, you can see that two regions stand out. North America, that's the smallest region in terms of number of countries. It's the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The NAFTA partnership has had a significant impact in the last 15 years in bringing very high levels of prosperity and certainly high levels of economic freedom, with Canada and the United States being typically among the top 10 countries in the world in economic freedom. Europe's a far more interesting case. If we'd looked at Europe 15 years ago, or let me move that back. If we'd looked at Europe 30 years ago, what you'd have found is two groups of countries. You'd have found one group with scores around 70, and another group with scores around 50. There'd have been quite a strong divergence in Europe. We don't find that strong divergence anymore. In fact, the countries that used to score or would have scored at the level of 50 or so, almost repressed, in some cases repressed economies, now have leapfrogged above the older Western European economies in economic freedom, and their growth rates are higher as a result. The other countries, they're not performing so well. Here's another way to look at the distribution of economic freedom around the world. We've drawn this as a very traditional world map. The darker the shading, the higher the levels of economic freedom. But next year, I've decided I'm going to redraw this map and center it on the Pacific Ocean. Because if you look at levels of economic freedom, you'll find that, in fact, it is the countries of the Pacific Rim that perform highest overall and have the highest levels of economic freedom. So I think it may be appropriate in the future to recenter this map. Does economic freedom matter? Well, I certainly think it does, and one of the ways we try to show that is through correlations with other social and economic indicators. We try to find out, does economic freedom relate with prosperity? One way we do that is by correlating it with gross domestic product per capita. We used to show this as a logarithmic scale, and it was a straight line, but I think it's more interesting to show it with the banana curve, because you can see what happens to these countries. Let me just step over here. I'm most interested in what happens to these countries right here. These are countries mostly in the mid-ranges of economic development. And what you can see is that if, with only small increases in economic freedom, they're going to be able to move rather far up that curve and enjoy very rapid increases in gross domestic product per capita. Another way of looking at the disparities, you can see that the countries that we measure as economically free have per capita incomes that are 10 times higher than per capita incomes in countries that are economically repressed. We also wanted to look and see, does economic freedom relate to democracy in any way? We took a look at the Economist Intelligence Unit's Index of Democracy, ran a simple correlation, and that's the result. So you can see a quite positive relationship between economic freedom as we measure it and democracy. We wanted to look at human development. We looked at the Human Development Index produced by the UN Development Program. You can see again that there's a high level of correlation. Countries that are economically free show higher levels, significantly higher levels of human development than countries that are mostly unfree or repressed. We want to take a look at poverty rates. Often you see in the press assertions that higher levels of economic freedom skew the income distribution and lead to higher levels of poverty in a society. We found, in fact, that that was not the case. We looked at the Human Poverty Index. Again, this is a product of the UN Development Program. And we related it to our economic freedom scores. And you can see that the countries that gained significant amounts of economic freedom did a much better job of reducing poverty than any other countries. Countries that lost significant amounts of freedom actually saw an increase in poverty, that 0.4 at the bottom of the chart there. And finally, we wanted to look at the environment. Again, because there is some concerns that high levels of economic growth may retard, in some cases, economic environmental protection. Again, we found a very positive relation between economic freedom and protection of the environment. This was a comparison with the Environmental Performance Index produced by the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. So on those 5 factors, we find high levels of correlation between economic freedom and high levels of social value in societies. How have scores changed over the life of the index? I put this up there because we now have 15 years of data, and I thought it was rather interesting to note that economic freedom, obviously the overall improvements in economic freedom have been driven primarily by increases in trade freedom and monetary freedom. And trade freedom, we've had the Uruguay round of international trade multilateral trade liberalization. We've had countries acting on their own. We've got the Doha round right now underway. And I think you can see that there's been significant progress in lowering tariff barriers, and that has driven our scores higher. The monetary freedom scores, I think, became much higher as a result of the Asian financial crisis, where central banks really did, in many respects, learn how to get it right in terms of controlling inflation, the money supply. The fiscal freedom size represents tax rates and the reductions primarily in Europe of tax rates that have taken place over the life of the index. At the other end of the scale, you look at business freedom, for example. Business freedom measures regulatory policies that are entirely under the control of governments. So it's really disappointing when you see scores going down on the business freedom indicator. It's interesting to contrast investment freedom with trade freedom. The basic policy framework is the same in each case, but in trade freedom we've seen countries were willing to lower tariffs on goods and not so willing to lower tariffs on services or investment. And so I think it's interesting to see the dichotomy there. And finally, property rights. You see an 8-point and almost 9-point drop in scores over the life of our index. And this is one of the indicators where there are the strongest divergences among the countries that we measure. The top performers in terms of economic freedom and economic growth all have scores on property rights of around 90, very high scores. There's another group of mid-range countries that cluster around a score of 70 on this indicator. But the poor performers, both in terms of economic freedom and in terms of growth, economic growth and GDP per capita, all have scores of 50 or lower on the property rights indicator. So this is a fundamental area where the poorer countries particularly might look and put their reform energy. Now, because I could, Marcia invited me to comment briefly on the current economic crisis. And you see I've said 2 economic crises. Well, the first one I want to talk about is the one that's pretty obvious to all of you, the capital liquidity crisis. I put up there some of the causes of it that I think you probably all have seen in other places: the housing market bubble, the long-term keeping of interest rates too low by the Federal Reserve in the United States, and the complex derivatives that were in the investment market that disguise the levels of risk. But I want to also talk about another economic crisis, and that's what I call the crisis of the global warming response. Now, you notice I didn't say the crisis of global warming, I said the crisis of global warming response. I'm not an expert on global warming, and I'm certainly not capable of talking about the extent to which global warming itself will cause a crisis. But I do know that the responses to global warming that are being proposed by governments these days, and that have already been tried in some cases with things like the Kyoto Protocol, I do know that those responses will cause an economic crisis in terms of higher energy costs, reduced energy usage, which will be catastrophic for the developing countries should it occur, and slower economic growth overall around the world. So I'd like you to think about that economic crisis that's coming. Now, when I tried to look at what caused these, when I looked at the housing market bubble, that seemed to be caused by government policy decisions that drove Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the United States to create mortgage market in areas that were not sustainable by the market. Interest rates too low, that definitely was caused by the Federal Reserve Bank, so I put government up by that. Try as I might, I couldn't think of any way in which government had contributed to these complex derivatives. So I think that pretty much is the responsibility of the private sector on that one. When you get down to the global warming response, well, higher energy costs, I think we're going to see either taxes or some kind of trade setup that will lead to higher energy costs. That's definitely driven by the government. The reduced energy use will be driven by government regulatory policies, perhaps some by the price system as well. And slower economic growth, I'm going to blame that on the government too. And I want to end my presentation to you just with a question. If government caused the problem, can government be the solution? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Miller and Dr. Alan Dennis. And Dr. Dennis is with the World Bank doing business. As you're setting up, I'm going to ask the control room, are you picking up the speakers?
I don't think there's anyone in there.
All right. So are you hearing everything? Because the mic isn't working there. Well, does anyone need Ellen to speak into this microphone? I think it would be helpful. Do you mind speaking into the mic?
Thank you for the opportunity to present the results of the Global Doing Business report. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but this was a project that started. About 5 years ago. This is actually the 5th publication, and it did start with a few number of topics, few number of countries, but over the years it has increased. As we can see from this slide, we reached a full complement of topics, which are the 10 topics you see in 2007, and we've maintained that right through to the most recent, right through to the most recent edition. Now, what is doing business about? Essentially, what doing business seeks to do is to measure the ease of business regulations and how they affect different business transactions in different countries. And the way we go about measuring it is by looking at the life cycle of a company, right from the starting of a business right through to the closing of the business. There are a certain number of transactions that businesses carry out on a regular basis, and what doing business seeks to do is to look at each of these transactions based on a particular case study and compare the efficiency with which these different transactions occur. So, for example, if I want to incorporate a business, if I want to start a business, how long will it take? How much will that cost me? What are the different procedures that one has to go through? So based on the standardized case study, we look at how that would differ from one country to the other. We currently have 181 countries that are being covered. We added 3 more in the most recent report, Bahamas, Ireland, and Qatar. We have dealing with construction permits. If you want to build a warehouse, again, what are the procedures that you have to go through? How much will that cost you? And in terms of employing workers, how easy is it to hire workers or to fire workers? And in the same way, to how flexible are the labor regulations? Registering property, if you want to transfer property from one owner to the other, again, what do you have to do in order for that to be legally binding? So all of these are covered under the Doing Business report. We'll look at some of them in details later, but we are protecting investors, which looks at the protections afforded to minority shareholders, paying taxes, trading across borders, and enforcing contracts, and of course, closing a business. You can divide indicators into what I would call time and motion studies, or you can also look at some of them and refer to them as legal indicators. In terms of the time and motion studies, they follow the entrepreneur through a set of activities, and they look at the times for each of those individual activities. What is the time that it takes, and under those activities, what is the cost? And this is just an example of starting a business, but starting a business is not the only time and motion study. Time and motion studies include, dealing with licenses, transferring property, taking your goods through customs, etc. So in this particular case, we can see that in Mauritius, there are some 5 steps that have to take place before the business can officially start, legally start. And it takes about 6 days, and it costs about 5% of Mauritius per capita income. So 5 procedures taking 6 days and it costs about 5% of the per capita income. And we benchmark this across all countries. So this standardized case is covered for all the 181. So we have information on all of these, not just for starting the business, but also all the other time and motion studies. Besides the time and motion studies, we also have what I refer to as legal indicators, where what you're looking at are the provisions within the laws. What do the laws say, and to what extent do these laws facilitate the business regulatory environment. In this example here, I'm referring to the protecting investors indicator. And what that indicator essentially looks at is what are the protections afforded to a minority shareholder in the event of a third-party related transaction. What extent, in the case of a third-party related transaction, the director is supposed to disclose this third-party transaction, and if there has been something that has gone wrong, to what extent can the minority shareholder sue the directors or make them liable for this transaction? So we look at that based on the law. We look at what the provisions in the law says. The same thing also applies to the employee workers indicators, and to some extent the getting credit indicators. Now, if you look at all these 10 indicators, how do we sum up and get our aggregate score? Essentially, we have the weighting system is the same. We don't give any higher weight to one index over the other. So, based on the ranking per each indicator, we calculate the average percentile ranking and then score countries. Based on that, for last year, these are the top performers. Singapore has been the top performer again for the last report, and also New Zealand. Now, interesting, a few observations to make here. Most of the countries in the top 20, I would say, by 30, are high-income OECD countries. Nonetheless, you do see some developing countries, middle-income countries that are there. For example, in number 13, you have Thailand that is there, and number 20, you have Malaysia. And for the first time, there's one country from Southern Africa, Mauritius, that entered the first 25. Now, what this says is the ease of the regulatory environment. It's important to recognize that doing business is not capturing everything that is important for investment purposes. For example, it doesn't look at infrastructure, neither does it look at macroeconomic stability or security. It's looking at the business regulatory environment and to what extent that facilitates certain business transactions. And even the business transactions are very specific. They're related to the 10 topics that I mentioned earlier on. Besides looking at the top performers, another area that we're interested is to see who's moving up, not just where you are. So we look at the top reformers from one year to the other. And this year, the top reformer was Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan carried out reforms. Of the 10 doing business topics, we recall that Azerbaijan carried out reforms in 7 areas. I think other interesting observations here are Egypt and Colombia, for the second year running, have made it to the top 10 reformers, in that in 2008 as well as last year's report, they still maintained it among the top 10 reformers. It doesn't mean that they're among the top performers per se, but it means that they're the countries that are moving the most in terms of easing the regulatory environment for doing business. You have also 3 sub-Saharan African countries, there's Senegal, Botswana, and Burkina Faso. I think that's also significant to realize that there are a good number of reforms that are taking place globally. If you look at the reforms that are taking place globally across regions, this has been a pattern for the past 3-4 reports that were produced. Eastern Europe is the region that has been carrying out the most significant reforms, in part due to countries that either have acceded or intend to accede to the European Union or are part of some association agreements. So that is a trigger or motivation for reforms in these countries. In terms of the different areas of reforms, again, this is a pattern that we've observed over the years. Which are the areas of reforms that are carried out the most? Starting a business almost every year tends to be the area where we see countries undertaking the most significant number of reforms. And in areas such as employing workers, new labor law, protecting investors, again, it's the area that we see the least number of reforms. To some extent, this can be understood because some of these reforms are administrative reforms, and they're a little bit easier to do compared to legislative reforms. Now, I don't know what is going to happen. As this data is valid as of June last year, and a lot of it was captured even before then. So I don't think the impact of the financial crisis has yet been reflected in it. And I think that there could be some changes in the coming year. For example, with the financial crisis, will it spur an appetite for carrying out legislative reforms, for example, in the area of getting credit? We may see some more reforms there. In terms of protecting investor rights, will there be sufficient appetite for governments to reform? So we may see something there. And also, what's going to be the impact on labor law? Are there going to be more protection afforded to workers to keep them in their jobs, or are there going to be more flexible labor laws implemented? I think it's too early to say, and I'm eagerly looking forward to what the results may be. I think the results will differ depending on income level as well as different levels of countries. But at this point it's too early. But I do think that it will have an impact in terms of the composition of reforms that we see. This year we had 239 reforms for the 181 countries, and these 239 reforms were for 113 countries that we were able to capture. These are positive reforms. Just go through a few of these reforms real quickly. So I talked about Azerbaijan as one of the top reformers. I just mentioned here just one of the reforms that it implemented, and that had to do with starting a business, where it did implement a one-stop shop, consolidated procedures, made it easier for enterprises to start businesses. What has been the impact of those reforms? We see an 87% drop. This is over time. Last year the drop was about 30 to 16 days, but over time it's been an 87% cut in time, and also a 77% cut in the cost of opening a business. Similarly to in Singapore, where it used to take 102 days prior to the implementation of electronic submission of applications for construction permits. Now it takes 38 days after the implementation of this reform. And in Rwanda, also carried out reform in the area of property registration, where instead of paying a 6% tax based on if you want to transfer your property, somebody will have to value it, and then you have to charge 6% of that. They introduced a flat fee. So what that did was it eliminated the need of the surveyor to value the land, and you just pay that flat fee. Reduced the cost of property registration from 9.4% to 0.6% of the property value. And similarly to over the years, we've seen significant drops in the time to export, and this is largely being driven by several countries undertaking electronic data interchange systems, allowing customs forms as well as other supplementary documents to be submitted directly or through electronic means to customs, implementing the single window system or post-clearance audits, and several other reforms which have helped to reduce the time for trading across borders. Now, why does all of this matter? I don't think I need to convince you about that, and so, a lot has been said already this morning. But this is just a very simple graph just to show the relationship between the ease of doing business index and then the level of informality as well as unemployment in the country. And what we do observe is that there's clearly a positive relationship. The more difficult it is to do business, the more your regulatory environment is constraining to business activity, the more informality you have in the economy, and vice versa. And also, the higher informality you have, the higher the levels of unemployment in the country. doing business has inspired reforms in, as of last year, this is our count as of last year, in at least 80 countries. 80 countries have either been informed by the work we are doing or have contacted us and through that have carried out reforms. And a lot of these reforms happen because there's a lot of competition going amongst countries because the neighboring country has done this and has improved, and so they learn either from the neighboring country or a best practice country. And we counted 80 of such reforms last year, and currently, as of our last count, there were some 94 ongoing reforms. And I think it's encouraging to see that a lot of these reforms are also taking place in Africa. We have a lot of information on our website, doingbusiness.org, and you can even find us on Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alan. So now we have Leah. Great to have you from the World Economic Forum.
Sorry about that. Now do it. Yeah? Okay. Thanks. Sorry about that. Some technical problem. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Jen for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, despite the cold. It's very cold. It's colder than Geneva for sure. And also, it's really great to be able to be here to listen and to discuss about, benchmarking, about how we can really provide data for better policies and practices, because that's what we are trying to do, all of us with our different indexes and exercises. So, brief outline of my presentation. I'm just going to introduce briefly what we do at the World Economic Forum in terms of Global Competitiveness Network and report. And then we really look at our main methodological tools, which is the Global Competitiveness Index, which is also used by the GEM report. And we have a brief look at the ranking for 2008-2009, even if it's true that they are a bit maybe passé since we launched them in September, and that was before the crisis, so a lot of things have changed since then. But anyway, and I finish by focusing a little bit on the US performance, only really to give you an example of the type of analysis we can do with our data. So, the Global Competitiveness Network is one of the oldest programs at the World Economic Forum. We almost have the same age as Davos. The first report was actually launched in '79 by our chairman, Professor Klaus Schwab. At the time, it wasn't very global. We were just covering 16 countries. Last report was covering 134. So basically, we are covering something like 98% of the global GDP. We will see later our coverage. So what we do, what we have done over the years, is really to try to determine the determinant of competitiveness. And we have been doing it over the years together with leading academics like Professor Michael Porter and Professor Sami Martin, who is the creator of our latest index. And really our goal is to provide tools for a policymaker and the private sector to get together and really design better policies and practices. Just to show the geographical coverage, as you see, we are covering, as I said, almost all the world. We are missing some countries in Africa, but apart from that, we are doing quite well. 98% of the global GDP, as I was saying. That's just to give you an example also of the fact that over the year we extended our thematic coverage in a way. Apart from the Global Competitiveness Report, which is an annual report, is going out every year in September, we have really started to look into different sectors which are important for a competitive economy, as well as country or regional specific topics. So as you see there, we have a competitiveness report on travel and tourism, which is the annual report as well. We have the Global Information Technology Report, which is the annual report, and two new reports which we launched last year, the Financial Development Report and the Global Enabling Trade Report. as well as some country-specific reports, because it's something that we are doing as well every so often when we have the funding mainly, to really kind of explore competitiveness with respect to a region or a country. Before really looking at the index, let's agree on what we're trying to measure here, because student competitiveness is a very broad concept. If I ask any of you, I'm sure we have a different opinion on what is competitiveness. For us, competitiveness is a very broad concept. It's not something which has to do with the market share, for instance, of countries in the global economy. It's not something which has to do exclusively with the attractiveness for FDI. It's really something which has to be with growth, with the potential of the country to grow in the long term. So if you look at this slide, it's really quite, what we want to do really, it's understand why, if you look for instance at Singapore and Chile, the yellow and blue and light blue lines, why did they over 30 years follow such a different growth path? Why is it so? Why is it so that country over 30 years, if you look at the GDP evolution, really show different growth paths? So what we really want to do with this, it's really trying to identify the factors, policies, and institutions which determine different growth paths in different countries. So it's really something which has to do with the productivity, something which has to do with the potential for growth. So really something which has to do with the structural characteristic of an economy. I'm telling that because you will see, you're going to be shocked when you see that the US is still #1 in our index. It's because really we are going to look more, this is not a forecasting tool, this is not an index, it's not very really sensitive to the business cycle. It's something which really try and assess which are the structural characteristics of an economy. So in a way, this index in the present situation of global crisis is maybe an indication of which economies are more resilient, which are the economies which have the tools, which have the structural characteristics to be able to overcome the crisis more rapidly. So this is the latest index we're using to assess country competitiveness. It's an index which has been adopted by the Forum in 2004, has been developed by Professor Simon Martin from Columbia University, a well-known growth expert. It's actually something which is improving, and it's adopting a more comprehensive look at competitiveness than the latest index we were using, which was an index which has been developed in 2001 by Professor Sachs. Over the year, of course, you know, the evidences and literature evolve, so of course we are always trying to use the best tool according to what we know and to the latest competitiveness theories. So this index is called the Global Competitiveness Index. As you see, there are 12 areas we're looking at, 12 pillars of competitiveness. It's quite broad, as you can say. You have institution, infrastructure, macroeconomic stability, education, primary education and higher education. You have the efficiency of the different factor markets. You have the technological readiness, meaning the capacity of the country to leverage ICT. Market size, which is not only domestic market size, but it's both domestic and foreign market size. Exports, basically, we're also looking into the exports. And then what is really more probably relevant more in common with the German index, the business sophistication and innovation, which are more the micro aspect of competitiveness. What is interesting in this index is that we're actually using the well-known economic theory of stages of development. You're all familiar with. Is a very well-known economic theory, and it says basically that the process of economic development evolves in stages, meaning that at the factor-driven stage, where most of developing countries are, firms and countries can still grow if they compete on cheap factor of productions. Second stage is the efficiency-driven stage, and it's the stage in which for countries is not, they cannot anymore really grow if they just compete on cheap factor of production. They need to start developing efficient production practices and also efficient markets. The last and most advanced stage is the innovation-driven stage, and it's the stage in which really for an economy to be able to continue to grow in the long term, it needs really to develop endogenous technology, really to develop innovative products using sophisticated production methods. So what we do with this theory is actually going back to the index. We use it to say that the 12 pillars of competitiveness are important for all the countries, but they have different importance according to the stage of development in which the country is. So for instance, for Chile is this year actually moving between efficiency enhancer and innovation sophistication factors. Both elements are important, but let's say Brazil, which is efficiency-driven stage, for Brazil, of course, it's still very important, the basic requirement of competitiveness, also because they are basic, so they're important for all countries. But really, Brazil competitiveness at this point of its development evolution, it's really the efficiency enhancer. So the fact to have a higher education system which is good quality, and it's actually providing the country with the right pool of human resources. The fact to have efficient markets, labor market and financial markets. The fact to be able to use ICT for in their daily life, and the market size. For a country like the US, of course, all the elements are important, but really US competitiveness depends on the last two elements, which are the business sophistication and the innovation. Now, it's quite interesting to see that in the case of the US, and also in the case of many European countries, the problems are really more, well, apart from the financial market sophistication, the problem are really in the basic requirements, no? Which is quite kind of funny. You will see later on, because you would think that countries at the last stage of development would have already sorted out the problems or the basic requirement of competitiveness. Okay, this is just to show you the way we are actually our classification by stages of development. What we use two criteria for that. One is the GDP per capita, which is a proxy for wage. And the other one is actually a criteria to correct for the factor-driven character of an economy. Just to explain you this concept, for instance, for oil exporters, because they have very high GDP per capita, they tend to finish in the most advanced stage of development. But it's true that they have an economy which is more factor-driven than innovation-driven. So we have we use on top of the GDP per capita another criteria, which tend to push back countries which export massively primary products and especially minerals. This is just the weight we are giving to the different stages of development for economists. So you see, for instance, a country in factor-driven stage is 60% of the weight of the index is actually on the basic requirement, 35% is on the efficiency enhancer, and only 5% is on innovation and sophistication factors. For us, only in the last and more advanced stage, innovation-driven stage, is the only stage in which really innovation and sophistication factors acquire a big importance, 30% of the total weight of the index. In terms of data sources, so our index, this index and all our work, we have many indexes. We use a mixture of two types of data: hard data, which is inflation data, which is quantitative, and this data we take from international organizations normally. We don't tend to go to national source because for us it's an extra work. While the data provided by the World Bank, the UNESCO, doing business, it's data which has already been validated and it's comparable across country. The peculiar element of our work is also the use of another type of data for dimensions which are important for competitiveness, but for which there is no hard data, or there is no hard data for the 134 countries we are assessing, or dimensions which are more qualitative in nature, like for instance the quality of education, or maybe the perceived level of corruption in a country. What we do is that we use perception data. This data came from an executive opinion survey the World Economic Forum is doing in all the countries we are covering every year. Normally we do it from January to May. And is a survey which really what it tries to do is to assess the business environment in each of the countries we are covering. The respondents are top business leaders. Normally they should be the top 5 in each company. And the sample is designed in a way to reflect the structure of the economy in each country, as well as the, let's say, the international exposure of firms, because we really need firms which have international exposure to be able to really respond to the question we have in this survey. So really, this is something which is quite important, I think, because it's true that the survey introduced an element of subjectivity. That's for sure. It's not an index which is based on hard data. But I think the element given by the perception of the business leader is really important, especially for policy making, to know what is the perception in their own countries. And also remember that for us, for the World Economic Forum, really what we want to do is really provide a platform for dialogue. So we find it's important to have also the perception element. This is the latest ranking. To say the United States is still #1, followed by Switzerland and Denmark. I mean, even when we were launching this index, which was last September, it was a bit surreal not to say United States #1. But again, you know, it's really what you have to bear in mind is that this is, as I said earlier on, it's really something which looks at the structural characteristics of an economy. So the U.S., of course, as you know, is experiencing one of the major depression of the last decade in this moment. But at the same time, there are characteristics of the U.S. economy, and I show you here, like, for instance, the capacity of innovation of the country, the flexibility of the market, the size of the market. The United States is #1 in the world. So all these elements, I think, are an element of strength, of structural strength of the country, which are hopefully going to help the country to overcome the crisis in the future. That we will see next year. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see how these indexes are going to be changed next year, because as you know, we have this perception part. So the survey is not we're actually doing now, so it's going to be ready by the summer. Personally, I think that since there's going to be a worse perception globally, so I'm not too sure whether the US will go down just for the perception, because it's true that even from last year, we have actually a variable which is called recession expectation. And if we look at the results of this recession expectation for this year, for 2007, it has already worsened very much in all the countries we're covering. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen next year. This is just an example to give you, and to show you how we use our data and how you can actually find the data in our reports. So this is what we call the overall assessment, and you have basically an overview of the competitive situation of the country. You have the ranking and the score for each of the pillars we are considering. I just want to say something about rank and score. It's true that rank, we always focus on the rank. We like to focus on the rank. And it's important to focus on the rank because it's actually the relative performance of the country with respect to the rest of the world. But the score is also important because the score is it's a measure of the absolute performance of the country. So many times the country maybe is going down because there are other countries which are doing better, but it's actually going up in score. So I think really we need to consider the two elements. It's two parts of the same story. This is something that we do, that you can do. It's actually spider charts comparing different country with different regions. And it's something which is quite useful because many times you have countries which are very similar in ranking but very different performance if you look at the pillar level. So here, just to give an example, I did the comparison between the United States and innovation-driven economies, which are the economies in the same stage of development as the US. And this is quite interesting because you have, of course, the US is overperforming the average of the innovation-driven economy in market size, but it's also outperforming in innovation, business sophistication, infrastructure, and labor market efficiency. Remember that here we have a lot of European countries, so that's where the problem is for those countries, labor market efficiency. While even last year, macroeconomic stability was one of the issues for the US, as well as the quality of the institution. Here we also assess the perceived security level in the country. So here is where the US goes down in that dimension. This is the same with the Oecd average. I think I'm almost done. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just go quickly, but you know we can discuss later. Oecd average. So again, it's a very similar performance. EU 15 average, the original member of the European Union, you see that it's quite interesting to see the difference again in the labor market efficiency, which is really a problem for the European countries, and also in innovation and business sophistication. The US is still outperforming these countries. This is actually a spider chart comparing the US, Switzerland, and Denmark, which are respectively #2 and #3, very different countries, small countries with a different story, economic story. But still, it's interesting because what I was saying earlier on, it's interesting to see that very similar ranks in reality hide a very different performance in terms of different pillars of competitiveness. And I just finished with this slide. This is something we're including for every country in our report, and it's actually, it comes from a question we have in our survey. We actually ask the business people we are interviewing to identify the most problematic factors for doing business in their country. And this is quite interesting because once you compare the different countries, it's very different perception of what are the problematic factors. For the US, last year, 2008, the most problematic factor had to do really with the tax, with tax regulation, tax rates, and also the inefficient government bureaucracy. So this is something that really gives you an overview, very quick, of what is the perception of the business leaders in each country. And just wanted to tell you that as for the Heritage Foundation, our data are online. For the first year, we are actually publishing the report online. It's online, it's freely downloadable. And also we have a new interactive website where you can actually play with the data. You can create nice charts and spider charts and scatter plots, whatever you want to create. And we hope this is going to really help for the general public, students, which are always asking us how to download our data. Thank you.
Wonderful information. Thank you so much. And Niels, come on up, and he's going to save us a little bit of time, so we have a little more time for questions.
Thanks, I will do so. And I think everyone has been here before the break, so actually it should not be that much of a problem. Okay, well, we've gone through the objectives of GEM. We want to measure differences in the level of entrepreneurial activity between countries, and also explain these differences and to identify policies. And this is very similar, of course, to the previous presentations we saw, but we focus on entrepreneurship. Well, we started in 1999 with 10 countries, and this is the picture as of 2008 regarding involvement. As you can see, GEM has developed a lot, but especially in the African continent, we would like to increase our sanctions, and also some parts of Asia. And in this sense, we are quite jealous of the previous projects, I must say. But still, we are the largest study on entrepreneurship in the world, which is, and we focus on individuals, and this is really an important aspect of GEM, I think, because entrepreneurship is about people starting businesses. This is also why we chose for the adult population survey method. So we call people and ask them about their perceptions in entrepreneurship, and also if they happen to be involved in entrepreneurship in some way. We ask a minimum of 2,000 people. We survey those in each country, and by collecting individual level data, this allows us to explore several types and phases of entrepreneurship. As we continue, our dataset grows, and we are now at the point that we have about 1 million data points in our dataset spread over all the countries and over this 2001 till 2008 period. And the advantage is, of course, that numerous indicators can be extracted from this very database. Some other unique features, well, we can also focus on special topics. We have the special finance reports, the growth expectation entrepreneurship. Every year, a female entrepreneurship report. This year we will have the entrepreneurship education and training report, and next year we will have social entrepreneurship. Another nice thing is that our research method is also applicable to regions and cities. So in many countries, we also see regional differences in entrepreneurship using the GEM method. And this is very relevant for entrepreneurship because entrepreneurship is very much a regional event. People starting up, most of them will do so in their own home and environment. And also, we see these urbanization economies reflected in entrepreneurship if we map the entrepreneurship rates across regions. So, well, the research method gives many opportunities for GEM. What is the procedure of this adult population survey? Countries select their own data vendor, manage their own process with review by the GEM coordination. So we have really specific requirements of quality requirements, and those go out to the national teams. They select their vendor, and the vendor has to fulfill these requirements. It's a mix, depending on the country, basically, of random telephone surveys and face-to-face surveys. It all depends on the coverage. What we want to have is the highest quality available. So we want to have good coverage. If there is not a good phone coverage, we do face-to-face. If the mobile coverage is better, then we do that. So this really differs per country. What we do have is common method and procedures. We overlook the data on centrally. We do multiple quality checks. We apply weights to get the sample really representative for the country. So by doing so, we create a harmonized data set with entries for all countries, so that we can really compare the entrepreneurship rates. And this is something that is very difficult to do with other kinds of data sets. But as I said, increasingly also in intra-country comparisons. And the nice thing is also that each country can add their own questions. So if they have a specific topic which is very relevant to the country, they can ask additional questions and implement this in their questionnaire. Okay, we've seen this one. This is like the most well-known measure of GEM, the total entrepreneurial activity rate. As I explained before, this includes not only the people who are already in business, but also the people who are trying to get into business. So it also includes the pre-birth phase, and this is of course very important also to policymakers to see what kind of people make it and what kind of people don't make it, and what could be the reasons of that. And I think also here's the Doing Business initiative is very important to see these determinants. Well, if we plot these TEA rates against the GDP per capita, we see this U-shape emerging. The R-squared is mostly around, I think, about 50%. So it's quite okay. So we see this trend that as the country develops from lower incomes, from the factor-driven economies, that the TEA drops because of a drop in necessity rates, basically, and afterwards we see an increase in opportunity rates. Well, I've talked about that too, so let's move on to the components. Well, we have several entrepreneurship indices, of course, in GEM, and they are basically, most of them are preference rates, so they are very simple measures, simply saying what is the percentage of certain kind of entrepreneurs in the adult population, or what is the characteristics of these entrepreneurs. So we have, these are very simple measures and they can be interpreted very well. So we have these attitudes and perceptions. We have several types of activities spanning different phases, but also different characteristics of entrepreneurial activity. Of course, we can look at age and gender and household income and education, sector structure, motivations. And first, important is that we can discern between different kinds of aspirations of entrepreneurs. So we have those who aspire to grow, those who actually want to stay small. There are obviously a lot of entrepreneurs who just want to be self-employed, and they might not even need to register or want to register. They are freelancers, so to speak. And these are also important to the economy, I think. Innovation is, of course, an important topic, technology, and we also have information on international orientation and several other characteristics of entrepreneurship. Well, when we look at the economic crisis, as I said, well, also here our surveys have been conducted, our latest survey, in May and June. So we cannot say too much about that as far as our results are concerned, but what we did see was that it has already influenced the attitudes. and mostly in, if I remember correctly, in Iceland and Hungary. So these are countries for which we already know that the crisis really has impacted very much. So, and obviously we can expect that these will also impact the characteristics like the degree of necessity entrepreneurship, but also the aspirations of new entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs may see the crisis as evidence that they will probably not grow as much as they would have done a few years ago, as they would think they have done. So this is what we may expect, and we will see this next year. We have not seen changes in entrepreneurial activity or aspirations this year yet. So I thought it would be a nice idea to again look at this global entrepreneurship index I talked before. I will not again state how it's measured, because I think most people, or all of the people, have seen this before the break already. But what we did also is to correlate these against the measures of the Global Competitiveness Report, the Doing Business Index, and the Index of Economic Freedom. It is confirmed that we all see the positive relationship. So the countries that score high on this Global Entrepreneurship Index also score high on the Global Competitiveness Index. It's not completely linear, it's mildly S-shaped, so we can see whether entrepreneurship has an additional effect here, if we really measure something that complements what is measured by the Global Competitiveness Index. So this may be quite interesting. We have to further develop the index, of course, but we see something happening over there. And if we look at the other indicators, we see, for instance, on the left-hand side, the Doing Business Index, and especially it looks as if at the far right-hand side, if with relatively small changes of the Doing Business Index, even if the country already scores high on the Doing Business Index, we see that entrepreneurship rises relatively much. On the other hand, the relationship with the Economic Freedom Index is more kind of linear, and to me this also makes sense, because the Economic Freedom Index is about how entrepreneurship could impact economic development, and so you would expect that the relationship is more one-to-one over there. So, and the correlations are actually quite high, as you can see, but still, of course, there are some differences, and this can help policymakers understand in what way they might have to improve entrepreneurship to impact economic development. Okay, so this is the last slide already. If I can make a conclusion, GEM measures entrepreneurial attitudes, activity, aspirations. Important for GEM is that it's the individual perspective plays a central role. We not only do the adult population survey, as we said before the break, the expert surveys, they are really important in providing useful additional information on the conditions of entrepreneurship, and here they, well, I would not say they overlap with the Doing Business indicators, but they play a similar role over there. Well, the individual approach enables to explore types and phases of entrepreneurship. We have kind of simple and transparent indices by doing so. They have prevalence rates, and the methodology is applicable to regions and cities. Well, the general global entrepreneurship index can be combined, derived by combining several GEM indices with indices on institutional quality. So that's basically what I would like to bring to the table. Personally, I think that especially the sub-indices are more interesting than the overall indexes, because you can really see what's happening. And well, we can talk about that maybe later on. So thank you very much.
Come up, please, the 4 and And Donna has given us an extra, we started about 15 minutes late, so she's given us some extra time. And of course, the cocktail party starts at 7, so we do have some flexibility here. While we're getting seated, if you'll formulate your questions. Yes.
Two simple questions. To the Global Competitiveness Index and the World Economic Freedom, or the Index of Economic Freedom. You're both talking about economic growth, and I'm interested in the private sector development component of economic growth. And you're both talking about the size of government in different ways in your indexes, but you measure it in different ways, the size of government. And in fact, I think, Irene, in the Global Competitiveness Index, you talk about the value of actually using size of government as a variable. So if you could just, but you're not measuring private sector, like the size of the private sector. So if you could comment on that. And my second question.
I have a quick response to that. Remember that what we're measuring is considered negative in our index. So when we measure size of government, we're doing it using expenditure data and also using tax rates for the fiscal freedom indicator. And the higher the involvement of government in the economy, the lower the score there. So it's a reverse relationship. So what's left over, in fact, is the private sector. And we regard government expenditure as driving out room for the private sector and crowding out.
Is there a certain level of government, size of government that should be there?
Oh, this is absolutely the hardest question you could possibly have asked me, and this is the one area where we're trying to refine our methodology, because we find scores on this factor that are very high for many African countries, and we know very well that what we're getting is a measurement of just either the absence of government or the complete inability of government to function in those countries. And that's not what we're trying to capture. So we're trying to find a way to revise the methodology. Yes, there's some level of government that's certainly appropriate in every country. They're basic public goods that need to be provided, and you're going to have some level. It's extraordinarily difficult to figure out what that level is. It won't be the same for every country or every country in every stage of development. So any advice you have would be very welcome, but that is a shortfall.
Well, you don't use employment share, you just use government expenditure or government consumption?
Government is a share of GDP. Government expenditure is a share of GDP.
Irene?
Yes. Well, as for the Global Competitiveness Index, we don't have, let's say, we don't measure directly the size of the government. What we do, we have a variable which looks at the wastefulness of government spending. So, and then we have several variables looking at the presence of red tape in a country. So we don't have a, let's say, a philosophical attitude on what should be the size of the government. For us, what is important is that it's not wasteful. I mean, really, the government should be efficient. And the second thing about the private sector, actually we have the last two pillars I have explained, the business sophistication and innovation, are actually really looking more at the micro component of the, of an economy. So there we are kind of capturing the potential of innovation and also the business sophistication of the private sector in a country. But it's true that the index is more, let's say, is more focused on the macro elements of competitiveness. In that, I think it's, other indexes can be much better in the sense, really, if one wants to look at the private sector contribution to economic growth.
We have a question here.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on the last question, and I'd like to ask all the panel members, if I may, to answer the following question. I'd like to put aside our challenge vis-a-vis research as such from this group. As you know, many of us are coming from universities, and this goes from research and published papers. But let's put that aside There are really three major constituents that we have to deal with as heads of national teams of GEM. One constituency is obviously the government, the public, the policymakers, that are elected and supposed to be relevant to the nations, etc. The other constituency is the private sector, as was asked in here. And the third constituency that we have to deal with are the potential sponsors, wherever they might come from, of our activities. And we wrestle with that year by year. And I wonder if each one of you, whether it has to do with the time and motion studies that you propose, whether it has to do with the Index of Economic Freedom, whether it is a very well-known World Competitiveness Index, and obviously our own GEM here. I wonder if you can come up in a sentence, tell us what is the main message that should come across to, as I said, first to the public policymakers, second to the private sector, and thirdly to our potential sponsors that might help us maybe do what we do better.
Great. Would you like to start, Alan?
The last part, which was the question, was what is the main message that we have for policymakers, for the private sector, and for sponsors, for the sponsors? Well, our aim in doing business, at least so far as the policymakers are concerned, are to trigger reforms that will make it easy to carry out business activities. So that's what we've been seeking to do. And I think over the past few years, there have been a good number of countries, and it is increasing over the years. I think that in itself has implications in terms of donors, because apart from the World Bank sponsoring it, also we do have some countries that have expressed interest in supporting us. For example, 2 years ago, we had Iceland donate some money, which allowed us to be able to expand the coverage of doing business to 20 small island and Pacific countries, because they had a specific interest in these countries. I think in terms of the private sector, we haven't engaged as much as we probably could, but I must add that the surveys are actually generated by the private sector. I mean, we don't have the information. It is the people who work on a day-to-day basis in these different transactions I talked about that provide the information. So we have at least 6,000 plus contributors. These are lawyers, accountants, tax consultants, freight forwarders, etc., who provide. So we have that collaboration with them, and as the program itself has been growing, we continue to receive requests by a lot of top lawyers, etc., saying we want to be part of your program. So in terms of the way we develop this relationship, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the main message that we have for governments is that that their efforts make a big difference, that they have it within their power to create an environment in which entrepreneurship and the economy can flourish, and that in many cases, through misguided policies, they are retarding that development. We do that primarily by helping them contrast their own countries to other countries in similar stages of development, or sometimes in a similar regional circumstance or geographic circumstance. So we do try to analyze the data to allow countries in similar circumstances of whatever sort to compare their performance with others. And when you do that, it really does stand out where the most energy needs to be put in terms of reform. We have governments, because we publicize our report extensively, we do have governments seeking us out constantly to ask what they need to do to improve their scores. Obviously, the score is not the important thing. What happens in terms of the development of their economy is the important thing, but we see one as a tool to get to the other. Your other questions were donors. I have an exceedingly privileged position in that I do not have to deal with donors whatsoever. I receive a funding stream and I can do my research based on that. So I really have no message there for you. And finally, to the private sector, they're a consumer of ours, and we find that they take our data and use it in turn to try to influence government policy. So they're incredibly supportive in terms of the data that we provide them, but they have no particular message that comes back to us except keep on doing what we're doing.
Okay, as far as GEM is concerned, also because we have two different research methods. One is the adult population survey, where we monitor entrepreneurship, of course, and this is a tool with which we can provide policymakers with more information on the heterogeneity of entrepreneurship and how this differs between countries, of course. This gives them information. I think this is important, but we also have the expert surveys, and this may also be a platform you can use for getting the results known, and also to attract sponsors, because in some countries they hold a workshop and they discuss the results, the global results, but also the national results. You can build kind of a community there. You can bring all kind of stakeholders, from the financial world, from the policy, but also entrepreneurs, and get them together. And these can be good environments to actually get your message across, I would say.
Well, for us, in line of the mission of the forum is actually what we want to do, and what we do with all our initiative at the forum is really to create a platform for discussion between the private sector and the public sector. And really what we want to do with this index, and I guess my colleagues here as well, is really to create measurement, create data, which can help policymaking and business leader and all relevant stakeholders to sit together and redesign better policy, really the data-driven policymaking that many times is missing. In terms of success in this regard, well, public sector, it's our main, I would say, it's our first and main constituency. We have lots of requests on how to improve the score and ranking. I think this is something that we all have. And private sector, we find that they're actually using our index really to go to the government and say, see, here there is a problem. And we have been doing in the last 4 or 5 years a roadshow in many countries in Latin America. They were actually sponsored by Microsoft, so they can make you understand how the private sector can use this kind of indexes. And it was really amazing. I mean, I did most of them, and it was amazing because we really had a lot of business leaders, a lot of NGO, policymaker in the same room. And that was used as a neutral assessment, because that's what we do at the Royal Economic Forum. We are a neutral organization, so that's what we do best. In terms of donors, we actually try to avoid donors because we want to keep our neutrality. But I think it's really, even business-wise, it's an interesting product, the same as any other product here presented, because it's true that it's really something which can help, it's a tool which can help better policies and practices.
I'd just like to add something earlier on, and this is the feedback that we get from governments and what they have found to be useful with our indicator. It's such that everything that may need a change, you can track it to. It's not sort of an aggregate number. For example, if it's a time on a procedure, if you want to improve, you can track it to, okay, this is the specific procedure, that is the obstacle, or it's a law or something, provision within the law. So this is the so governments find it tractable and easy to work with, because they can understand it, rather than having a big index which, okay, I know I need to improve upon this, but what do I need to put my finger on?
Very specific.
It's very, very specific. And also, if you go to our website, you can do the simulations yourself. We have a simulator where you can say, okay, if you change this law, or if you improve upon this procedure and it reduces by this is how I will rank also. So you can play around with the simulator on the website yourself.
When these companies or these countries call you, do you consult with them? I mean, do you have a consulting arm that actually? Do you have a product? It's a consulting?
No, unfortunately, it's something that has been going on for a while. I mean, our problem is that we want to keep our neutrality. We are benchmarking, so at the same time, we don't want to consult. But we're always happy to go there and explain. The only thing is that we don't do, in a way, what we do is more like a basic assessment of what is going wrong, and then it's really for the country to decide what to do.
Questions? Yes.
I've got a question for Mr. Dennis. First of all, I think the whole doing business project is fantastic, and it's made life a lot easier for millions of entrepreneurs all over the world, so congratulations. Secondly, your case study that you use, from our perspective in GEM, it's a very unusual type of startup. Now, it serves your purpose in that it covers almost every regulation that entrepreneurs might come up against, but it's not typical. And I wonder whether you thought of looking at a second case study, which might be a more typical startup. Maybe one person starting with a partner, maybe not even employing somebody at the beginning. How long would it take them to get started? I think that would be an interesting contrast against your big startup.
Second, I think that would be interesting, but when you're doing a study for 181 countries, there's always going to be, trying to find a standardized, case study. And in this particular case, we're looking at a limited liability company, and we have other parameters employing a certain number of people, and we follow all that is required by law. So it depends on what is required in that country by law, because those are the obstacles, or are part of the obstacles that affect entrepreneurial activity. So if we leave part of the process out, we may be missing something. That's why we look at what does the legislation say about starting a business. If you are going to follow the legislation as it is, how much time, so it's a very simple question. This is what the law says. How long will it take if you're going to go through it? And yes, some companies may be able to start up, but they might not have registered with the Social Security or with the tax administration. They may be doing, but we want to look at the full breadth. If you were going to comply with all that was required, how long would it take you? And so that's our focus.
Yes.
I'll ask that question relates to exactly that. You mentioned, Alan, in your presentation at the end that you found that the level of informality was a factor. So the more difficult the doing business environment, the higher the level of informality. But yet you don't study informal enterprises. You only look at the limited liability companies. So where do you get your informality measures? And how do you rationalize the fact that if you look at raw T rates, the total entrepreneurial activity rates, that countries that are the most adverse to doing business also have the highest level of entrepreneurial activity?
They've been done, I don't know, for the past 10, 15 years or so. So there's a good basis for information on that. And so we're able to pull out that data and compare it to doing business.
Based on informal share of employment or informal informality or
I don't know how they specifically measure that, so I don't want to make, but it's widely used, it's widely accepted. I think it's a standard measure of informality.
We have time for one more question, and then let's ask, will you all be at cocktails with us tonight? Yes. So we will have the opportunity to speak more tonight. So one last question, please. Yes, right here.
Do you think it could be possible to have in the future this indicator in the regional level intra-countries, like the case of GEM, for example, in United Kingdom or Chile or Puerto Rico or Spain or Germany?
I'll just answer for doing business quickly. What I mentioned to you was a global doing business report, but we do have regional global doing business reports as well as country global business reports. And then, for example, our standardized case study looks at the largest city. Of course, if you're talking about, say, Mexico or the United States, which are big countries, there's several cities and there's a lot of heterogeneity among these cities. So we have separate studies that compares, from one city, to another, and all these reports are available on our website.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel tonight.
you.